Okay. In just a moment, we'll be getting back to the major players. Before we did that this evening, I wanted to begin our time by referencing a couple of those passages that we had talked about over the last couple of weeks as it related to some of the interactions with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and Jesus and Paul that indicate or that reveal to us some of the ways in which these sects that that were interplaying and who would interface with the New Testament and with Jesus, how this kind of would play out. The first one that I had mentioned was Jesus, and then we'll go to the one that Sarah had mentioned last week. Jesus speaking in Luke 20, and in Luke 20. There is an attempt by the Sadducees. Jesus is in Jerusalem, and there's an attempt by the Sadducees and the scribes to question Jesus. And in verse 27 of Luke 20, the Bible says, "Then came to him certain of the Sadducees, which deny that there is any resurrection, and they asked him, saying, Master, Moses wrote unto us, if any man's brother die having a wife, and he die without children, that his brother should take his wife and raise up seed unto his brother. There were therefore 7 brethren, and the first took a wife and died without children, and the second took her to wife, and he died childless, and the third took her in like manner the 7 also, and they left no children and died. Last of all, the woman died also. Therefore in the resurrection, whose wife of them is she, for 7 had her to wife." Now, we know that this is a disingenuous question because we know that the Sadducees deny the resurrection, right? So they're asking a question about the resurrection that they don't even believe exists. And we, of course, have traced the Sadducees, recognizing that they are from that aristocratic, elitist line. They do not believe in the resurrection. They have rejected all of these things, specifically because they were Hellenized at one point, right? However, all of that being said, we also recognized from our study that they did regard the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, as authoritative, and they had a uniqueness of interpretation as it related to those things, considering they denied the supernatural. But simultaneously, they regarded the Torah. And then all of this plays into how Jesus answers their question. Verse 34, "And Jesus answering said unto them, The children of this world marry and are given in marriage, but they which shall be accounted worthy to obtain that world and the resurrection from the dead neither marry nor are given in marriage, neither can they die any more, for they are equal unto the angels and are the children of God, being the children of the resurrection. Now that the dead are raised, even Moses showed at the bush, when he called the Lord the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, for he is not the God of the dead, but the God of the living, for all live unto him." So Jesus gives this response, and he speaks toward marriage, and he says there's no marriage in the world that is to come because they will be equal to the angels. This does not mean that we become angels, right? That is not what the Bible says. The idea is that as angels are spiritual beings, so too we will be spiritual beings. Our bodies will be, we will have bodies, but they will be fitted for a spiritual existence. They will be resurrected bodies. They will not be these bodies that need to breathe air and eat food and that need all of the systems that have to do with living in this world. We will not need any of those systems to live in the world that is to come. Now, we presumably might have taste buds because eating is something that is enjoyable, and there are different fruits on the trees in New Jerusalem as it's painted in the book of the Revelation. So there may be taste buds still, or whatever the case may be, but we won't have to eat to live because we don't live, I mean, we live forever, right? We're immortal. We're clothed in immortality, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. So there's a different existence. So to that end, Jesus corrects them and says, you have a misunderstanding here because there will be no marriage. We will be equal to the angels in that regard. Angels do not marry, nor are they given in marriage. And then he says, and then he directs their thinking toward the resurrection. And he says, now let's talk about this resurrection bit. because he knows, even though they pose their question within the framework of the resurrection, he knows they don't believe in it. And he said, and he goes to Moses at the burning bush and argues there that God spoke to Moses and said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And because God is not the God of the dead, he's the God of the living, the fact that he said he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob means that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were not dead in that sense, right? Their bodies were dead, but they were still very much in existence. God acknowledging that by the fact that he calls himself the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And of course, we see that in Luke 16, where you see the rich man and Lazarus, and the rich man is actually calling to Abraham, right, from death, from Hades, from hell. And so we see that Abraham is there, and he's lucid, and he's talking, and such. Sam brought this up as we were talking about this after church last week, that the fact that Jesus was arguing directly from the Pentateuch to prove the resurrection is very, very important, because the Sadducees only regard the Pentateuch, the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, as authoritative. The rest of it is not authoritative. So he needed to go to those first 5 books in order to establish his argument for the resurrection. And this is a very unique thing. And for those of you that remember when I preached this in Luke, there are very few definitive resurrection proofs in the Pentateuch. And if you trace this argument, which has become it's a standard Judaistic, Orthodox Jewish argument now for the resurrection, it really is sourced in Jesus. There's no document, there's no tradition found before Jesus, before Luke, before Jesus said this, before Jesus' day, that has any sort of a statement of this principle of using Exodus, of using Moses at the burning bush to prove the resurrection. And so they make this proof, right? Or Jesus makes this proof to the Sadducees. Notice verse 39. Then certain of the scribes answering said, Master, thou hast well said. You can almost imagine that as Jesus says this, they're like, oh, we've got it, right? We finally got the Torah proof of the resurrection. We can finally, argue with the Sadducees from their own books of authority about this point. So they're just thrilled, right? And remember, the scribes are associated with the Pharisees, right? So they're Orthodox, they believe in the resurrection, they believe in everything the Pharisees did, and so they're like, wow, this is great. Jesus himself giving them that proof that they sought. And so now they're really happy. They call him Master, right? Master. The scribes weren't big on calling him that, but Master. Yeah, this guy now has authority. He wins the day. This is the strange new respect thing I was talking about, right? Now this guy's a master. Before he was, we needed to quiet him down. Now he's a master because of this great thing that he has said. And then it says, and after that, they durst not ask him any questions at all. They just stopped asking questions, because even when they throw out a hypothetical, Jesus not only answered their hypothetical, but then debunked their theology. And then he warns them about the scribes. Ironically, he goes on and he says, in verse 41, we say, and he said unto them, and he's asking the scribes now, not the Sadducees, but the scribes. How say they that Christ is David's son? And David himself saith in the book of Psalms, the Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou on my right hand till I make thine enemy thy footstool. David therefore calleth him Lord. How is he then his son? And it says, then in the audience of all the people, he saith unto his disciples. So, and then he'll warn against the scribes. So there he's kind of saying, well, scribes, I'm not going to let you off the hook. I just gave you a nice theological win here. But now I'm going to tear down one of your sacred cows, right? Now I'm going to talk about why will you not accept me as Messiah if I'm the son of David? Because I can go to your authoritative text and I can prove me, just like I went to this authoritative text and prove the resurrection. So you agree with me on that one. Why don't you agree with me on this one? Or why can't you answer me on this one? Why is this one so hard for you? And so then he kind of shows their hypocrisy and tears them down from their lofty perch for a moment there. and then warns the people. He says, beware of the scribes, which desire to walk in long robes and love greetings in markets and the highest seats in the synagogues and the chief rooms at feasts, which devour widows' houses, and for a show make long prayers. The same shall receive greater damnation. And so he warns quite strongly about that. Thoughts or questions on that interaction?
It's almost like two kids that, they're squabbling, so they're like, oh, we have a third person, let's have them. And then he just kind of puts the one in the thing, and the other one's like,
That's right.
And he's like, well, for that, here's your toast too.
That's right, exactly. And that's exactly what it is. And so, here they are, and the scribes and the Sadducees have this little thing going on, and Jesus is in the middle of this thing, and Jesus says, I'm not going to let either of you off the hook. But what is also interesting is that the Sadducees were trying to nail him, and then after he answered so clearly and even tore down some of their sacred cows, they're just not going to ask him anything, right? And the scribes didn't ask him anything either. And then he asks them that question, right, to show that measure of hypocrisy in them. Okay, Acts 23 is the other one. Acts 23. Here Paul is standing before the council. And the council would be the Sanhedrin that we talked about. This would be that council of 70. They had power, and then Herod kind of cut them down. But then they regained a measure of influence, but only in Judea, right? Judea and Samaria would be the technical area that Herod had, but Samaria would not have been under the authority of the Jews, so they only had Judea. So they lost some power after Herod, whereas they would have had more broad sweeping power before. And of course, Paul was safe when he was outside of there, which is why, if you recall, on Sunday night, was it, or was it Sunday morning, where I talked about Paul going to Jerusalem, then to Rome. It was Philippians, so it was Sunday evening. It's kind of tough when I'm in the New Testament both in the morning and evening to remember which one's which. Remember that he was warned not to go to Jerusalem from Caesarea. Caesarea was in Galilee, right? So he was safe in Galilee. He started in Ephesus. There was a warning in Ephesus, then in Caesarea. But when he was in Caesarea, he was still safe. It wasn't until he went to Judea that he was in danger, because that's where the council, the Sanhedrin, had their power, right? And so Paul is standing before the council, and he says in verse 1, and Paul, earnestly beholding the council, said, Men and brethren, I have lived in all good conscience before God until this day. And the high priest Ananias commanded them that stood by him to smite him on the mouth. Then said Paul unto him, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall. For sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law? And they that stood by said, Revilest thou God's high priest? Then said Paul, I wist not, brethren, that he was the high priest, for it is written, Thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people. So Ananias had told him to be hit against the law. He was hit, and so Paul rebuked him for doing something which was illegal, until he realized that he was the high priest, at which point he repented of that, because he will not speak evil of the leader of his people in obedience to God's command. Let that be a good reminder to us as it relates to how we speak of our own rulers. When Paul perceived that the one part were here it is in verse 6. But when Paul perceived that the one part were Sadducees, and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, Men and brethren, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. Of the hope of the resurrection of the dead I am called in question. And when he had so said, there arose a dissension between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the multitude was divided. For the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, neither angel nor spirit, but the Pharisees confess both. And there arose a great cry, and the scribes that were of the Pharisees' part rose and strove, saying, We find no evil in this man, but if a spirit or an angel hath spoken to him, let us not fight against God. And when there arose a great dissension, the chief captain, fearing lest Paul should have been pulled in pieces of them, commanded the soldier to go down and to take him by force from among them and to bring him into the castle. So Paul is very shrewd here, right? He is standing there. He's been able to give the gospel. He's just rebuked the high priest. He repents of that because he was not to be doing so according to God's word. He has already made his point. He says, I have lived before God in good conscience until this day. I'm not doing anything now that is contrary to my conscience, just as I was not before. And then he sees, okay, some of these guys are Sadducees, some of these guys are Pharisees, and he kind of decides that he's going to take the pressure off of himself, and he's going to change the topic a little bit. So he says, the real reason why I'm standing before you, the real reason why I'm being questioned is because of my belief in the resurrection of the dead. See, because his preaching was that Jesus has risen from the dead, right? That's the gospel. This Jesus has risen from the dead. They say, stop preaching Jesus rose from the dead. He says, this really isn't about Jesus. This is really about the resurrection. And that immediately gets the Sadducees really uptight, right? Because there is no resurrection to them. And so they say, no, there isn't even a resurrection. And then the scribes that were a part of the Pharisees, they sit there and what are they going to do? Are they going to attack Paul, or are they going to use this as an opportunity to gain a measure of political advantage over their adversaries on the council? So they say, look, this guy, he's doing fine. Why are we even holding him? I mean, if the Spirit has spoken to him, if he's seen a vision, right, and all of this is about those guys who don't believe in visions. Like, that is all that is about. If he's seen a vision, then we just need to let this guy go. If this is really just about the resurrection, well, then he's fine. He's good. We just need to let him go. And Paul, and notice Paul right after he says that, he gives his credentials. I'm a Pharisee, and I'm the son of a Pharisee, right? So again, the Sadducees are like, ugh. This would be very similar to standing before Congress with a 51 to 49 majority in the Senate, and then bringing up some sort of deeply partisan issue that kind of touches on what you were about, and then immediately having the partisans just start fighting each other, trying to score political points and trying to gain the best of the other rather than actually focusing on the thing. So these are times where we see this conflict between the Sadducees and the Pharisees really bubble up in Scripture. And again, we talked about the Sadducees. Of course, the Pharisees having been that grassroots group of people who were well trained in the Scriptures, who believed it hyper literally, and the Sadducees being the liberals of the day. Thoughts or questions on this one? Okay, I don't have my clicker. Let's move on here, and we're going to move into the Essenes. We're going to talk about the Essenes before continuing in our history of the Maccabees. Oops. So the Essenes, they're often understood to be the third Jewish sect next to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They did not necessarily have any political clout as we would see of the Pharisees and the Sadducees in Jesus' day, because they were a separated community. About somewhere north of 4,000 people were generally seen in this community. It was generally, or more or less, similar to a monastic order. They had completely separated themselves from society. They were not really a part of anything. They kind of had completely removed themselves, wanting all of the religious distinctions that we might say were probably closest to the Pharisees, but were unwilling. They were too ideologically pure to get into the mud of politics. So they just wanted to just be left alone, do their thing, not worry about politics, let the Pharisees and the Sadducees fight out that stuff, and we're just going to do our part. Do our thing. We first see them spoken of in the time of Jonathan Maccabeus, 150 BC or so. probably an offspring of the pious from the days of the Maccabees, a community that had separated themselves once things had settled down. They lived under communal guidelines, so kind of a socialistic living, very similar, we might think, to a Mennonite community, or what's the one that Mark works in? No, Hutterite, to a Hutterite community. Amish too, naturally, but the Hutterites in particular are, they have no private property rights, right? Among the Hutterites, everything is communally owned, and that would be the same thing here. Each person contributed to the order. There was no buying or selling. There was only exchanging. So you couldn't sell anything. You couldn't buy anything. You would exchange something that you have for something that someone else has, because everybody owns everything. So you have possession of something, but it's the community's, and so you're going to exchange and such. They saw God's sovereignty as absolute. They rejected the free will of man. So the Pharisees did believe in the free will of man, right? They believed that man had a free will. Like we said when we studied the Pharisees, there was quite a bit of parity between what the Pharisees believed and what we actually believe today as it relates to theology. They believed that God was sovereign, but that man also had a free will. And that would be also in line with what Orthodox Jews believe today. They believe both in God's sovereignty and in man's free will. Of course, the Sadducees were Hellenists, and so they didn't really believe in God in that sense. They believed everything was rooted in man's free will, a la the Greek philosophers. And then you had these Hutterites, who would have been sort of the Calvinists of the day, right? That man doesn't really have a free will, that everything is about God's sovereignty, and that it is absolute, so what happens is what God wants. This may have had its roots, actually, as we see here, in one of the Greek philosophers, Pythagoras. Unlike Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, who are all very much so involved in that free will idea, Pythagoras did have a philosophy that did not believe in free will. And again, we see that in the secular world today as well. The strong atheist, the consistent atheist, does not believe in a free will. Atheism, at its core, refutes the idea that man has a free will. What they boil it down to is, because there is no God, because we're just products we're just animals, we're products of our environment, we are nothing more than stimulus and response. And so we don't really get to choose our own path. We are only shaped by the environment that is around us and the stimulus response. That something comes in because of how we've been shaped by our history, but how we've been shaped by our culture, something invariably comes out. And that is that we cannot do anything else but what we do because of our environment and our training and such. So the Essenes had that sort of an idea, just very deeply mixed with the Jewish roots. The specific points of custom that the Essenes had: no slaves. There were no slaves allowed among the Essenes. They were all equals within their community. Again, a very communal idea. No oaths of any kind. No anointing with oil. I've yet to be able to figure out quite where that one came from, what the root of them refusing to anoint with oil was. There's a Jewish historian named Edersheim who has a very large volume on the history of the Jews, and I've been working my way trying to find out if there's any more about the Essenes I can draw. He has a good section on the Essenes from which I drew a lot of this, but I'm trying to see if there's something in there that explains that. They would bathe in cold water before meals, so they'd cleanse their entire body before a meal. They'd only wear white robes, sort of a drawing of the priestly idea, right? Strict modesty, no marriage, no animal sacrifices, and they'd only eat food prepared by the Essene priests. So these were their customs. And yes, sir?
So no marriage. So
Correct.
No marriage relationship at all.
Correct.
Had to recruit everybody.
Yeah, and so the Essenes didn't last long, which is probably why we don't see them in the New Testament.
Was it typically male? Was it a mix?
It would have been mixed.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like monks and just mixed.
Yeah, in a sense. I'm trying to think. It would have almost been like people that just wanted to make a perpetual Nazirite vow, in a sense. People who wanted to completely consecrate themselves and would live that lifestyle. And it wasn't, it was certainly not about perpetuating from generation to generation. It was a decision that they would make. Yep. Yep. So sort of like, so in that way, very much like a monastic order, only that it was not, it wasn't like a leadership position, so it wasn't like a male-only type thing. It was just a community thing. Yes?
What percent of the population do you think?
From the point that we see it in history, which was around the Maccabees' time, 4,000 plus people. I'm not quite sure what percentage of the population that would be. It was probably a relatively small community, relatively speaking. Yep, Sam.
And I don't know, I've heard this before, but is there bathing in cold water kind of where baptism comes from? Or is that something?
I am not sure. I'm trying to think. In the Old Testament, we don't really have a lot of baptism. I know that baptism is not just a Jewish cultural thing. It was something that was found in various cultures. And yet I'm not sure as far as it goes. I'd have to look into that a little bit more. It's a good question. Other questions or thoughts? So those are the Essenes. Yes, Sarah?
They're mentioned in the Bible, correct?
No,
No, they're not.
I don't believe they are.
They interact with the Essenes.
I don't believe so. We only really see them, I believe, in this intertestamental time mentioned. So if you were to read the Maccabees, I think you'd find them there, but not in our New Testament. The Zealots are, though, and the Zealots would have been very similar to the Essenes, only hyper-political. This is almost like the religious wing, and then the Zealots would be the political wing of the extremists, as it were. Simon, we're back to Simon Maccabeus. By Jonathan's death, the Jews were led by the Maccabean party. The Hellenists were driven out, and religious freedom was completely obtained. So we have Simon, and he takes over. He supports Demetrius of Syria, who is a rival to Trypho as regent and king. He's awarded Jewish independence when Demetrius is victorious. So Demetrius is supported by Simon. Simon is successful because Demetrius is successful at becoming the regent king. And to that end, political independence is given to the Jews. We read in 1 Maccabees 13, verses 36 to 42. King Demetrius, unto Simon the high priest, we are ready to make a steadfast peace with you, yea, and to write unto our officers to confirm the immunities which we have granted. And whatsoever covenants we have made with you shall stand, and the strongholds which ye have builded shall be your own. As for any oversight or fault committed unto this day, we forgive it, and the crown tax also which ye owe us. And if there were any other tribute paid in Jerusalem, it shall no more be paid. So they're getting rid of all tribute toward Syria on behalf of the Jews. And look, who are meet among you to be in our court, let them be enrolled, and let there be peace betwixt us. So in other words, send ambassadors, send people that can represent you to us. Thus the yoke of the heathen was taken away from Israel in the 170th year. Then the people of Israel began to write in their instruments and contracts in the first year of Simon the high priest, the governor and leader of the Jews. So then we see this freedom. Simon then continues conquest. He takes Gaza, he takes Joppa harbor, he takes Bethzur, and then he drives the Syrian garrison out of the citadel of Jerusalem, 142 BC, and that was a part of that final element of peace there. You notice that that's all in the first year of his reign. 1 Maccabees 14, 11 through 15. He made peace in the land, and Israel rejoiced with great joy, for every man sat under his vine and his fig tree. And there was none to fray them, neither was there any left in the land to fight against them. Yea, the kings themselves were overthrown in those days. Moreover, he strengthened all those of his people that were brought low. The law he searched out, and every contemner of the law and wicked person he took away. He beautified the sanctuary and multiplied vessels of the temple. We have this phrase here, and this phrase is an important Old Testament phrase. I spoke about it not too long ago in, I believe, Jeremiah, or Lamentations, I suppose it would be. The phrase, every man sat under his vine and his fig tree. Does anyone remember what that phrase means? What's the implication of that phrase? Sarah? Peace and prosperity, that's right. The picture is of a man who is eating of the fruit of his own property, of his own land, and of his own labor. It's his fig tree. He gets to eat of his own fig tree. He gets to sit under his fig tree. If he chooses to rest, he can rest because he's not under bondage. If he chooses to eat from it, he eats from it because it's his. And that picture, every man sitting under his own fig tree and sitting under his own vine, is a picture of peace and of rest, of freedom. And this is the only time within the course of this 450 years, really more than that because you add Babylon to that mix, where Israel is autonomous, where they are their own people, and it will not last for too long. So we see this picture. I give you the verses here. 1 Kings 4:25 speaks of it. Jeremiah 8:23 speaks of it. And then Micah 4:1 through 4 speaks of it as well. And I'm going to skip reading those, but the end of Micah 4:4 there, they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree. And this is messianic, right? So this Micah 1, these two, 1 Kings and Jeremiah, 1 Kings is when they are dwelling in safety, right? In the days of Solomon. The days of Solomon being days of peace and of rest. And then in Jeremiah, that's talking about the day where there will be no grapes on the vine, no figs on the tree, because they will be in bondage. And then in Micah, this is the last days. And this is the millennial kingdom. And in the millennial kingdom, once again, we're seeing this. So recall the very messianic flavor of the time of the Maccabees. And imagine that in that time of Simon, there may have been a real feeling that maybe this is the time. This is Messiah's time. This is the time. We've gotten rid of Syria. We are now independent again. Maybe this is the time for Messiah to come. And the messianic fervor of this time, built, feeling that freedom, that independence. So Simon becomes the first official ruler of the independent Jewish states since the pre-exilic days of the kings. He's declared high priest, not king, military commander and civil governor of the Jews in September of 141 BC. And this high priestly dynasty of the Hasmoneans was officially founded. The vision of Jewish independence begun by the Maccabees takes shape. But notice 1 Maccabees 14:41. Also, that the Jews and priests were well pleased that Simon should be their governor and high priest forever until there should arise a faithful prophet. What's the reference there? Until there should arise a faithful prophet.
Is that the Messiah, the prophet that Moses spoke of?
There you go. So it would be from Moses' day. Deuteronomy 18, verse 15. The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me. This is Moses speaking. unto him ye shall hearken. So Moses says there's coming a day when the Lord will raise up a prophet unto you like me. What are some of the distinctions of Moses as a leader and as a prophet that we still haven't really seen duplicated in the prophets and kings of Israel? Why is it that there hasn't been, throughout all of the Old Testament, another prophet like unto Moses? What's unique about Moses that makes us recognize that this promise here, which obviously the Maccabees understood to be messianic, is messianic? That the faithful prophet is Messiah. And that's it. Yep. Remember when God gave the 10 Commandments, he didn't give the 10 Commandments on a tablet at first, did he? He gave them verbally. And as he gave them verbally, the people were so terrified by hearing the voice of God that they looked at Moses and they said, Moses, never let God speak to us again. You speak to God, and then you speak to us, and we will regard your voice as the voice of God. You will be the mediator, and what you say, we will simply trust you that if you said it, God said it, and we will obey. And God was very pleased with them for this. God said this is a good thing, that they would accept this. Why is it such a good thing? Because the nation of Israel is willing to acknowledge that there can be a mediator between God and man who will speak the words of the Lord, and they will implicitly regard them as the words of the Lord, and thus believe them as if it were God the Father himself speaking those words. And so he becomes this type of Christ in that he is the mediator, the singular mediator between the words of God and the words of the people. Thus, he is the representative of God to man. And we don't see this again. We see the thus saith the Lord of the prophets, but this idea of raising up a faithful prophet that is rooted in this idea that there's coming a Messiah. And that Messiah will be like unto Moses. He will be the one who mediates between God and man. And of course, we know that Jesus became that. 1 Samuel 2 speaks to this as well. This is when God is rebuking Eli. Thank you. I kept wanting to say Enoch, and that wasn't it. Eli. And because Eli's line was not faithful, right? Or Eli was not faithful, his line was going to be abolished. We saw that happen in the days of Jeremiah. Yes. It was in the days of Solomon that Solomon deposed the final person from that line. Thank you. And the faithful line would be the line of Zadok, right? We see that in Ezekiel. And so there was a near fulfillment of that in Zadok. And Zadok's line, that's the faithful priestly line, that's the line that we find in the millennial kingdom in Ezekiel. But simultaneously, we recognize that this to be a entirely messianic prophecy, and they understood that in the day of the Maccabees, and we know that from 1 Maccabees 14:41, that they understood it to be messianic. This is why they never crowned another king. They never crowned another king after the captivity, because from that point on, they were rather singularly focused on looking for their Messiah. So they never sought to reinitiate even the Davidic line. We know that they knew who was of the Davidic line, because, Joseph and Mary, right? Not to mention the genealogy in Matthew traces the whole thing, right? And in Luke, traces the whole thing. They had the genealogy. They knew who was of the line of David. They knew who was of the sons of Solomon, who was of the sons of Nathan. We see both of those genealogies in Matthew and Luke, respectively. But they never put anyone else on the throne, because after the captivity, all of those expectations of the messianic promises were imminent. It's like imminent messianic promises. The Messiah is going to come. He's going to take the throne. He's going to conquer. And that's why when Jesus is walking in the temple at the Feast of Lights, the Sadducees ask him, are you Messiah or not? Basically saying, why aren't you just go put yourself on that throne? Just go do your thing if you're Messiah. Ambassadors at this time are sent to Rome. And Simon does this seeking recognition of the Jewish state. Now remember, a little while back, there had been a league between Rome and Jerusalem, and so they had this mutual agreement. We'll help you, you help us. And that was that first major rebuff against Syria. And it was granted this recognition of a Jewish state in 139 BC under the authority of President Lucius Valerius. And remember, at this time, Rome is not yet a empire rule fully, so they still have a republican sort of a system going on, at least in name. It's collapsing pretty strongly at this point, but we'll get to that in a little bit. 138 BC, Syria's new king, Antiochus VII, rescinds Domitius' good graces on the Jews, demands that Israel be reinstated under his authority. Naturally, Simon refuses and is met with force. 135 BC, Simon's son-in-law, Ptolemy, seeking power, invites Simon, Judas, and Mattathias to a feast, and he has them all murdered. So there's a lot of intrigue happening here. Simon, Judas, Mattathias, all murdered in 135 BC by Simon's son-in-law. The Jews immediately appoint his son, John Hyrcanus, to the priesthood as the high priest. Hyrcanus attacks Ptolemy's stronghold. He's hindered by Ptolemy taking his mother hostage and threatening her life. So he is unwilling to, pursue the fullest end of the destruction of the stronghold. Because of this, under this hostage situation, he is allowed to go. He is allowed to flee, but he still murders Hyrcanus' mother as he flees. Soon after this, Syria invades Israel, sieges Jerusalem, negotiates their withdrawal, but in doing so, there's a high price for this. There's a tribute that now must be paid, must restore various conquered cities, and then the walls of Jerusalem would be torn down. This does not necessarily sit well with Rome. Rome has not, to this point, exercised direct control over Syria. They've not really started fighting Syria, but Syria doesn't want to mess with Rome. Rome is very strong. Rome has its own issues at this time that it's dealing with in other places, but Rome later demands that Syria gives these cities back to the Jews. However, the Syrian state still had some measure of influence. So at this point, that fairly short amount of time where they were truly autonomous has kind of come and gone. Antiochus dies in 129 BC. Syria is thrown into a civil war. Hyrcanus uses this distraction to seize the land of Jordan. And then here is where he subdues the Samaritans and the Idumeans, and he destroys the Samaritan temple in Mount Gerizim. Samaria would eventually be completely destroyed by Hyrcanus. Notice this as well. Hyrcanus forces the Idumeans to submit to circumcision and to receive Jewish law. So you have Hyrcanus, and Hyrcanus is kind of the pinnacle of the nationalistic Jewish fervor. He gets in there, and naturally, he has been forged by his past. His father and two uncles were murdered. He takes over, and he's trying to deal with Rome and Syria, and he, in his fervor to conquer, really sets his sights on both the Samaritans and the Idumeans. And remember, the Idumeans are the Edomites, and they are the descendants of Esau. And so you have the Samaritans, and he destroys their Temple Mount. This is the point of no return as it relates to any sort of relationship between the Samaritans and the Jews. Now, this is in the 120s or so, probably somewhere between 135 and 105 BC. So we're talking about probably close to 120, 130 years before Jesus is interacting, maybe close to 150 years perhaps would be better, reckoning before Jesus is interacting with the Samaritan woman. So you've got another 150 years before that point where the Samaritan woman says the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans, before all of those things. But this is where the deepest roots of that bad blood come from. Is the Samaritans, they had their own thing going, they had their temple in Gerizim, and Hyrcanus goes in there, he destroys their temple, and he begins to lay waste to the Samaritans. This is also where some of the issues surrounding the Idumeans come from. Hyrcanus goes into Idumea, he subjugates the people, he forces circumcision upon them, and he forces them into ritualistic Jewish observance. So this is not something that they had done, but he effectively forces them back into the Jewish fold in a sense, though they were only descendants of Esau. Internally, Hyrcanus broke away from the Pharisees and attached himself to the Sadducees, which is interesting, isn't it? This is one of the very few times in this 450 years, and particularly since the Maccabees, where, well, I guess it wouldn't be the whole 450 years. This is one of the only times between when the Maccabees overthrow and the New Testament where we see a switch back to a Sadducee domination. And this is the first time during Hyrcanus' reign that we see these names, Pharisee and Sadducee, officially recorded and mentioned in history. The Pharisaic order would not find traction again for about 40 years, after which point it would never lose traction again until the overthrow in 70 AD. So Sadducees got another about 40 years there. Of course, Hyrcanus had no interest in the Syrians taking over, though, right? So at this point, the Sadducees are not going to resubmit to Hellenism in total. And it's a really interesting pairing, because the Sadducees were those theological liberals, and yet Hyrcanus had this nationalistic fervor. And this is perhaps somewhat similar to what we see in Israel today. There's this, the election has been going on for, almost a year now, right? Because Benjamin Netanyahu has been elected a couple of times, but he has not been able to form a government. Because of the nature of the government there, you have to form a coalition. And so then you have to have a new election if you cannot form a coalition government. And while his opponent, and I forget his name, but while his opponent is very different in a number of ways from Netanyahu, they have the exact same foreign policy. They both, you're not going to get a leader in Israel who does not want Israeli independence, who does not want safety, who does not want that foreign policy, right? That's not changing, even if the other guy gets in who's significantly more liberal in many areas. The foreign policy is going to be the same. And that might be kind of what we're looking like with Hyrcanus. The nationalistic zeal is not going away, even though he's more on board with the Sadducees than the Pharisees. So he's not quite that legalistic sect, but he's still overthrowing the Samaritans and the Idumeans, and he's forcibly circumcising the Idumeans and such. And so that's not going away. Okay, we'll just talk about the Samaritans a little bit more tonight, and then that'll be it for this evening. The Samaritans, let's talk about them. Begins with the captivity of the northern tribes of Israel around 740 BC. We find this in 2 Kings 17. About 150 years before the captivity of Judah is the captivity of the northern tribes of Israel. And when they are taken captive, they're not taken captive by Babylon, they're taken captive by Assyria. The Assyrians had a very unique method of avoiding the dangers of nationalism. If you think about the Civil War, right? In the Civil War, you had the North and the South. You had the Americans and the Confederates, as it were, the Northerners and the Confederates. And when the Confederate states lost, it effectively meant that they were not allowed to secede from the Union, right? That the federal government imposed upon them forcibly the Union of the United States. And then in that time, they were welcomed back into the Union, but they were allowed to maintain their distinctives, their cultural distinctives of the South. So, to this day, there's a lot of Confederate flags that fly in the South. There's a lot of Southern nationalism. And wherever you see a situation where a country is conquered but they're allowed to maintain their national distinctives. There's not really, in all corners of that, a full loyalty to their conquerors. The Assyrians mitigated this problem by pulling everyone out of the land that they conquered and dispersing them throughout their empire and intermarrying them with their own people. So the Assyrians, they remove Israel from the land and they move them to all of the other places within their kingdom, within their empire. Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Hamath, Sepharim, and they get the people from those lands and they bring them into Samaria. The Bible tells us in 2 Kings 17 that because of this, God allowed lions to come into the land and to kill the people. We don't know exactly all of the ins and outs of what that means. Apparently, God just worked up the predators of the land to become excessively violent and to constantly be killing the people. These Babylonians and whatnot that moved into the land of Samaria. So they go to the king of Assyria and they say, we don't know how to appease the gods of this land. Would you please get some of those priests of the land that were already here and bring them back and have them teach us how to worship the God of this land so that he'd stop having these lions kill us and these animals kill us. So they do that. Now remember, northern Israel had a mixed religious system. Golden calf worship from the days of Jeroboam. There was a golden calf in Bethel and there was a golden calf in Dan. And so it was already a mixed worship system. They called it Jehovah. And Jeroboam took priests instead of from the priestly line. He took them from the lowest of the people, made them priests, and they worshiped this golden calf hybrid system. So now Israel's priests come back into the land and they're teaching this golden calf hybrid worship system to these Assyrians and Babylonians and whatnot. And so now you've got them mixing their Assyrian stuff with this already messed up kind of golden calf Jehovah worship, but they still recognize the roots in Israel, in Jerusalem, in Jehovah. Jehovah's still the God, and so it creates this really unique mixed religious system. They became known to the Hebrews as the Kuthians, and the Greek name for Kuthian in Hebrew is Samaritan. So a Samaritan is a Kuthian. They're the same name, and they're this people group of Assyrian, Israeli hybrid religious system and people. They're mixed blood, mixed race. After returning from the Babylonian captivity, the Jews begin to build the temple under the leadership of Joshua the high priest and Zerubbabel the governor. Upon entering the land, the Samaritans desired to join their endeavors. They came and they said, hey, we're descendants of Abraham. You're descendants of Abraham. We're descendants of Isaac and Jacob. We're descendants of Israel. This is the land of Israel. We're those descendants. You're those descendants. We want to come and be a part of this. The Jews refused because they were not clean. They had intermarried with the Assyrians. This made the Samaritans very angry. They resolved to hinder the progress of the temple and were very successful. They even gained the support of the king. Likely the king would be Cambyses who gave the support. They wrote a letter. They said this is a problem. Jerusalem cannot be rebuilt. He agreed. And then Darius the Great allows the temple to be finished. And of course then Nehemiah is sent by Ahasuerus to rebuild the walls. You can read about that in Ezra and Nehemiah. The threat of the Samaritan attack led by a man named Sanballat, that was probably a title like Pharaoh, Sanballat, is so prevalent that the workers had to work armed, right? So they had a sword in one hand and they were building the wall with the other hand. Sanballat infiltrates the Jewish priesthood through his daughter. History tells us her name was Nicaso, marrying Manasseh, the son of Eliashib, the high priest. That's where we merge with Alexander the Great. While in Tyre, Sanballat asks Alexander to allow the Samaritans to build a temple in Samaria to make Manasseh the high priest. That would be the son of the high priest who had intermarried with Sanballat's daughter. And Alexander agrees. He lots, and he agrees particularly because if you recall when we talked about Alexander, Jewish tradition states that when he came, he had a vision, and the priest came out to welcome him, showed him in Daniel where he was, and Alexander regarded the Samaritans as close kin to the Jews, so he was very favorable to them as well, and he actually funds the building of this temple in Gerizim, and they build this temple. So this temple has been standing since the days of Alexander the Great. And the Samaritans have worshipped there ever since until John Hyrcanus, right? He comes in and he destroys the temple and he slaughters the Samaritans and he ends up overthrowing Samaria. The Pharisees would lose traction in those years, but then as they gain more power, then they have this strong urge of separatism against the Samaritans. So much so that as they will regain power and they will regain influence, they will regard the Samaritans as lower than the Gentiles in standing. Absolutely unclean. So the Samaritans did not all die out, but they would simply exist after this point as outcasts among the Jews. And of course, as you might expect, would have a tremendous amount of resentment against them. So the Jews, John Hyrcanus makes the Samaritans hate the Jews. The Jews' nationalistic fervor will naturally make them hate the Samaritans. And this is really, John Hyrcanus is where the depth of the bad blood comes from. From him deciding the Samaritans need to be no more, a nationalistic zeal tearing down that temple in Gerizim, and killing many of the Samaritans. So in John chapter 4, when the Samaritan woman says, you say we should worship at Jerusalem, but we say that in this mount we should worship. She's speaking of Mount Gerizim. She's speaking of the temple that was built there. She's speaking of their worship system that was rooted in Gerizim. But notice she says, as they're interacting, she says, but when Messiah comes, he'll tell us everything. They're still looking for a Messiah. They've got this weird system, this hybrid system, but they're still looking for Messiah because that's deeply ingrained in that Jewish worship system that was a part of that hybrid. Okay, so that is the Samaritans, and we'll stop there. Any questions?
Just wanted to
Karina.
clarify,
Mhm.
Ptolemy was brother-in-law to Hyrcanus?
Yes. Was it Hyrcanus? It was
Yeah, but, no, next one, yeah.
Simon.
Right.
Simon, brother-in-law to Simon. Hyrcanus was Simon's son.
So he was a nephew?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yep. And that was probably in some sense a political marriage of sorts as well, as it would relate
So
to.
I'm trying to figure out the mother. It was Hyrcanus' mother, so it was like his sister-in-law that Ptolemy killed?
Simon's son-in-law was Ptolemy. So,
But James was also
so Hyrcanus would be his brother-in-law.
Yeah, okay, so they were brother-in-laws, so
Yep.
so Ptolemy killed both his mother-in-law and his father-in-law.
Yes.
I would not want to be his wife.
Yeah. And of course, being that he's a Ptolemy means that he's from the Egyptian area, right? And he would have been a part of that, which Egypt has fallen off the scene. They're very weak now. And at this point, they're probably very close, if not already, under Roman rule. And we know that as we get closer with, if you think of Antony and Cleopatra, right? Cleopatra being the ruler of Egypt at the time, that there's going to be a strong linkage between Rome and Egypt as Rome is then exerting their power. Yeah. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so we're at 105 BC now, so we're getting there, right? We've only got about 100 years left to get to Jesus, and then we'll be able to kind of have the whole picture.
Thank you for listening to Pastor Jamen Wikler from Legacy Baptist Church in Buffalo, Minnesota. More information about Legacy Baptist Church and a library of sermons are available at www.legacybaptistchurch.net.